Jacksonville. The child was born but couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts. The poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history in this land of flowers.
On the 29th of April 2018, this is our last show for the month of April. The week that was on WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. The week that was is basically a summary of the week's prominent stories, events that affect the political and, to an extent, the economic and social fabric of the U.S. And the world from a perspective, obviously, in the U.S. is what we are attempting to do here. Over this weekend, we'll have Numbers Man, our economic report that focuses on macroeconomics. We'll have GDP and talk about GDP and Q1. That's the first quarter and what is going on and where the economy is heading. Looking at the price of crude oil and pump prices and how that affects consumer discretionary spending. More than 70% of spending in the U.S. and in many of the other capitalist economies, the UK, etc., comes from consumers. Can consumers go, quote-unquote, the long haul? One of the big questions we'll be looking at. And hopefully we can get together an open source report. And incidentally, coming up next week, two things we'll be covering in conjunction with the activities on the Korean Peninsula. The annual meeting of Berkshire Hathaway in Omaha, Nebraska. That is Warren Buffett's shop. And we cover it each year and been covering it for basically a decade or more. And we have special May Day celebration. That's the International Workers' Day. We always have a program for that. And May Day being this year, let me just check the calendar here, on Tuesday. And in some places it'll be celebrated the weekend of the 5th, which is the 5th of May, which is also Cinco de Mayo. So we have a number of things coming up this weekend. Let's start with the Korean Peninsula, and this is from Reuters. The headline here: the Korean media in the Democratic Republic of Korea will make it right here. Hails a summit as Trump pushes for full denuclearization. And a picture of Field Marshal Kim Jong-un waving from his limousine as he leaves the Republic of Korea. It's a long process. This war has been going on 65 years. and to conclude it will take some time, no doubt. And between the two parties to the conflict, they will conclude the conflict, and then a matter of what they will do next. Obviously, to end the conflict officially, and then as two nations, they can go thus forward. And some are confused about this whole situation. The Korean Peninsula, the agreement between the two Koreas has to come first before you can start to talk about denuclearization. And it has been blown out of proportion in the Western media, the input of DJ Trump. DJ Trump is basically following along in this episode, and one needs to remember that DJ Trump is there. Various American regimes have been there, and the Democratic Republic, have suspended nuclear activities in the past. Now, the reason for the nuclearization of the peninsula is pressures, whether it be by economic violence, which is normally called sanctions in the West, or by direct military maneuvers. With the of Australia here, Turnbull made a speech in Australia about what to do there to put pressure on. But the problem here is, whether it be with Australia, the UK, France, etc., the US, they are still following the Wilsonian foreign policy. And that has not been addressed. It's a racist foreign policy. It's the same policy that moved the U.S. Primarily into the Korean War. Now, that was on the so-called phony UN mandate. And the People's Army of China joined the Koreans in fighting them, and they fought to the 35th parallel. I want to make sure we get this right. But anyway, they are still basically there. That's Panmunjom. That is where they have the site there. But one has to understand that this has to be brought about under a theme of Korean unity. Now, it'll be very interesting as they finalize this. This will make the sanctions obsolete, unless they want to literally have sanctions against the Republic of Korea also. And the point Reuters makes here is the state TV, as they call it, broadcast footage of the summit. But you have to understand that people in both the North and the South, they get news informally also, so they knew about the summit. And now everyone knows about the summit, period. And the whole idea of whether it be Australia, the U.S., maintaining pressure through these economic sanctions, news conference in Sydney, that is Malcolm Turnbull, the right-wing Prime Minister in Australia, praised DJ Trump there. Well, no doubt DJ Trump is in the middle of this. And I will quote him. I have given him that credit because Trump has taken a very, very strong, hard line. Well, on the denuclearization issue, no, what Trump has taken is a warlike posture that he would basically turn the Democratic Republic into a sea of five, basically speaking. And Turnbull goes on to say, Turnbull, goes on to say the economic relation there is overwhelmingly with China. So China's preparedness to impose these sanctions have been critical in the change that has taken place. Now, this is a two-edged declaration here. He's praising China, which China is the important actor here. What the U.S. does is of little consequences unless China moves. And you have to talk about the states that are there. China and the Russian Federation, they have more of a stake in this. The U.S. really doesn't have a stake in this at all. It's not in the U.S. sphere of influence there. And this has to be remembered. The U.S., through its old allies on the Wilsonian foreign policy and NATO, they brought Australia into the Vietnam War. And Canada in there. And that was a losing war. Now with Australia has a big stake in this because in the area where Australia is, China is very, very important to them. If China were to put the screws on Australia, the idea of their economy surviving, they would be in trouble. Period. A lot of trouble. Because you have to look at the global situation now. You have the UK and various others, France, which is now getting a little bit of economic growth, not very much. In Spain, you throw most of the EU in there. Germany, which the Chancellor Merkel was in Washington, no agreements are there. They are a country, the Germans that is, that they make things. So thus, the flow of trade is very important to them. I did not say free trade, but trade, as it is to the Australians. But you have to understand also the posture of the Australians. Australian foreign policy has been a very racist foreign policy also. And these are things that need to be discussed and brought out to the public so the public understands that these policies are 65 years old. And this whole idea of economic violence, whether it be the sanctions against the Democratic Republic or the Russian Federation, are just that. And they will only disappear when the Russian Federation has enough economic wherewithal, economic power, that they are able to sustain and fight on a footing with the U.S. And they're moving there technologically, they're moving there militarily, and also with China. This is why you hear all of this hullabaloo about China. China has been putting money into science and education. The U.S. has not. We'll go out to Arizona and talk about the problems there with education. That is extended to Colorado and all of basically a red state like Arizona. But when you've had a decade, 10 years of disinvestment in education, what that basically means, you're 10 years behind the rest of the world. And today in knowledge work, that is very difficult to catch up with. And what you have, say, in the U.S. is that the citizens have been misinformed to the actual position of the U.S. in terms of education with the rest of the world. And that is the reason that they are having these difficulties with China. Now, as far as the sanctions go back to the Smoot tariffs, that the U.S. was in a better global position. Now they're not. The Chinese have a plan that's called 2025, that they will basically go internal. That the money will be made based upon their 1.2 billion residents and other strategic partners that they have around the world. It's not dependent on what the U.S. does or the U.S. does not do. And that is the big problem. So that's the reason they've been trying to ban Chinese smartphone producers from the U.S. market. One of the problems is the commodification of smartphones, whether or not they ban certain Chinese operators from the U.S. market or not. They have the components, and so what Apple has done is Apple, for one, will start making some of their own components. Now, it's not clear at this point those components will be made in North America or they will be contracted out to other contractors around the world. So those are some of the things, a more nationalistic stand. That can happen. But with the present state of the economy, if consumers start to falter in the U.S., there is a problem. And of course, with the increased cost of gasoline or petrol, that impacts the consumer discretionary power, which impacts many, many other things. And for some of these states, Texas, for example, that is now based upon a lot of it on the earnings of petroleum. Oklahoma there also. And the changing of that whole makeup. An example in where President Obama went there in Cushing, Oklahoma, big distribution site. There will no longer be a big distribution site because of the pipelines. They can move that on to the Texas coast. Anyway, we started off here. Let's go now to the Washington Post. The reason we use these papers because they tend to be more of a national, particularly the Post. Now, from the U.S. borders, the so-called caravan has now arrived at the U.S. border. And the people will gather there and with their immigration attorneys and ask for political asylum. And they give an example here of a young man that's named Garcia. Brian Garcia, that he's not wanted in the U.S. by the Trump administration. There are 300 or so remaining members of the caravan have arrived at the end of the month-long geographic and political odyssey that was across Mexico. They have arrived at the border there at Weissendorf, California, where they will approach the U.S. Customs and the ICE agents and formally request asylum. There, they will now, no doubt, probably not be accepted, but 100 people will try. And what this does is this puts the world's attention on them. And when they started out, there were only 1,500 people. That is not very many. And with all the National Guard, and this is where it's a little bit confusing here, an American president cannot deploy troops within the United States on the Comitatus. What they can do is they can send National Guard troops there. But the National Guard troops are a very weak situation in itself. So it really doesn't mean very much at all there. The Nielsen, she is the head of Secretary of Homeland Security, threatening caravan members with criminal prosecutions if they file a false claim. Well, you know, again, these threats are just that. Wassendrow detention center can hold about 300 people. This is from the San Diego field office there. And these people have many, many stories that they have been criminalized in the countries that they come from. They've been threatened, etc. And that's the normal basis for political asylum. Whether they come from El Salvador or they come from Guatemala or whatever. Period. They would like to put this back on the Mexican government, but that is not working as well as it used to. Well, we have to Washington Post, one other thing here, in terms of privacy and data. data on a genealogical site, sorry about that, leads the police to the so-called Golden State murder suspect. Now was worried about the treasure trove of data, which we'll call big data, means Americans have bought into an exciting new world of consumer genealogy, sending sample tubes of DNA to websites that offer the service. There's 23andMe, Ancestry.com, one of the bigger sites. At least Ancestry and some of the others are based in Utah. The Mormon Church has a big collection, has had one of ancestors if you want to get into Ancestry. But one has to understand that this type of genealogy is relatively new, and it is not exactly what it used to be, what it is put out to be, I would say. Police matched crime scene DNA to a distant relative of the individual that they're looking at the present time. Dozens of killings, rapes, etc. that were there. Now, the one place, we looked it up, it's called GED Match, bare bones geological database of volunteered DNA samples, whose operators said they didn't realize it was being used by criminal investigators. What happens is you take this Joseph D'Angelo, a former policeman, small town copper, and primarily a mechanic, 72 years old. So how they were able to match this up, and one guy was talking about, if you've seen the Rockford Files, the old payphones, etc., filing reports via typewriters, dusting prints was a big thing, no doubt. They still dust prints. But DNA and various biometric samples, I know at the gym, you can put your handprints, palm prints, etc. into a database, and you can sign in with it and a PIN number, a two-factor sign-in. Even the people who consent by uploading their DNA samples often don't imagine the way the information can be used. That is from Ephraim Murphy, at the New York University law professor, who researches forensic technology. They aren't really thinking about the impact of creating this treasure trove of data that can be mined. And this is what the GED Match company does. And they are one of those consumer sites, such as those for less than $100. Millions of people have sent it in. Now, they use GED Match, does not sell testing kits. They assist people in matches that upload DNA profiles provided by other sites. The database now includes roughly 1 million distinct DNA sets, and that's where they were able to use that particular site. And we looked at it. The companies and leaders of the young consumer genealogy industry have served up the top contributors to a vast landscape of publicly available online DNA data. It's thanks to the advertising budget of 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Ancestry.com is primarily also a place you can look up obituaries. Anyway, GED Match's privacy policy says its tools are for comparing and research purposes, and encourage people to think closely about what they are providing. In the end, you require absolute privacy and security. We ask that you do not upload your data if you require absolute privacy. The founder there, Chris Rogers, said in a statement, but while we were not approached by law enforcement or anyone else about this case, or about DNA. It always has been the policy to inform users that the database can be used for other purposes, no doubt about it. So you have to remember these things. There are consequences out there. There's no such law for private DNA sites, as from Kenneth Maines, founder of the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases. He says he has had personally run DNA markers from many genealogical sites in order to help move a case forward. Any resource that helps or solves the 200,000 plus so-called cold cases. So there's some of the things going on. Some legal experts compare the use of public genetic databases to the way authorities can scan other personal information provided to third parties, including phone companies, banks, and suggest further scrutiny as to the amount of publicly available DNA multipliers. The law often lags behind, and no doubt the technology has evolved. That's from Barbara Quiddy, a University of Michigan law professor, former U.S. attorney. With DNA, most of us have the sense that feels very private, very personal, even if you give it up to one of these third-party sites. Once you give it to a third-party site, it is no longer private. That's why we're featuring this. She also questions whoever users who submit their DNA knew of the data ramifications. The use of genetic databases can open up avenues for investigators probing other cold cases. It left numerous questions unanswered, and how many other DNA samples from innocent people have been inspected by police. And there is no doubt in a society that rewards overstepping by police force, that is the perfect for a police state, no doubt about it. Even if users are content with making the trade-offs with their personal data, also making the trade-offs with their extended family, their children, their children's children, and that's not just making it for 2018, but 2020, 2040. In other words, once you're in the database, you're in the database. Before the breakthrough, the Golden State killer case had been long stymied. Detectives, that's from the Sacramento Police Department, they said investigators had worked for years trying to learn the source of the DNA recovered from the crime scenes and link it to D'Angelo were found and put under surveillance when he discarded an unidentified item containing DNA. Detectives grabbed it and they tested against DNA taken from one of the crime scenes. This is a problem. Criminals like D'Angelo tend to hold on to things. One of the first quote-unquote laws of being a criminal like that is you dispose of everything. In other words, the clothes that you wear doing your crime and any other items that could be part of those crime scenes. You don't keep them around. Some of these characters keep them around as trophies, who knows. But anyway. So, let's see. Schubert said after a second DNA test and matched, police arrested D'Angelo. She defended the work. Naturally, she would defend the work. I'm sure those questions will be raised through the court process. She said, I know they are sitting here today with an individual in custody of probably one of the most significant serial cases of all times. But it was an old case that had been long forgotten. Period. And D'Angelo, I don't know his condition. Many times these cases, what happens is people literally die in the interim there. So it is a trade-off, no doubt about that. Let's go to Uncle Carl Rowe. Where's Uncle Carl here? He's somewhere here. we have him. It's basically a rematch, with Uncle Carl about James Comey. He's on a publicity tour for his book here, Mr. Comey, 10 Days Following This Uncle Carl Robe. Comey's loyalty isn't to the truth. Well, again, this is editorialized. He's trying to spin it. For 10 days, the former FBI director has had a high-profile media tour to promote a higher loyalty. With for more than 600,000, they printed 800,000, still printing. The book leaves compelling, resistant favorite. What happened, the fire and the fury, in the dust. But behind the awe and shock, not shock and awe, was the only honest man in the room, persona. Well, that's why he had a higher loyalty. He calls itself an aggrandizement. Comey would call it the truth. Consider 2 episodes here. That's all he could find. He writes in 2003 that he was drawn into the Valerie Prime investigation. Valerie Prime was a covert undercover CIA agent, leaked the identity out there because of a critical co-op that her husband, that her husband wrote in the New York Times, I believe, or it was the Washington Post. Anyway, Comey, then the Deputy Attorney General, was appointed as Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald, used to be the U.S. Attorney in Chicago, writes that he stood by the decision to charge this Scooter Libby character that Trump just pardoned. Now, this is interesting there. False statement, perjury, obstruction of justice. He was convicted in 2007. The vital facts are missing from the account. Most importantly, that no one revealed a covert CIA agent's name. Thus, his reference to Mrs. Prime several times as an undercover agent. She was not. That's not true either. While the Deputy Secretary, this is Richard Armitage, he was also an assistant to General Colin Powell, who revealed Prime's name to the columnist Robert Novak. Was never indicted. Well, no, he was never indicted, but he was placed under scrutiny. Now, Mr. Comey also failed to note that the star witness against Scooter Libby, this is Judith Miller. Well, Judith Miller, unfortunately for Judith Miller, was known as a liar. She covered a lot of military activities in Iraq, and that she lied. So forget about Judith Miller. She became disgraced, although she did spend some time in a jail. Fitzgerald misled her and withheld exculpatory evidence that would have kept her from unwittingly giving a false testimony. Now, again, in a rebuff to Fitzgerald and Comey, the District Court of Appeals cleared Mr. Libby to press his lawyer again in 2016, well before the pardon he earned earlier this month. Well, yeah, but he was still a convicted criminal. Now, again, that doesn't mean a lot. That's a little bit confusing. I didn't know that they cleared him to press his lawyer again. But this Scooter Libby had a checkered past. There's no doubt about that. Judith Miller, even a more checkered past, that she worked with the government authorities, particularly the CIA, and she fabricated stories. She worked in the New York Times, left as a disgraced so-called reporter. And many of the people, particularly in the U.S., that worked as so-called foreign correspondents, were influenced by the U.S. government, particularly the CIA, etc. So they were literally just writing copy for the CIA. And he goes on to talk about Andrew Codd and John Ashcroft. John Ashcroft had an attack of pancreatitis. And Comey talks about in his car. He was the acting attorney general because of Ashcroft. And Mr. Comey raced to the medical center. His vehicle screeched to stop. He ran up the stairs, all 6'11" of him, ahead of Card and Gomez. Card was the chief of staff at the White House under G.W. Bush, and Gomez was the attorney general. Don't know what happened to Alberto Gomez, but anyway, Comey's report, willing to work to fix any legal issues. This was a stellar win scope. They did fix it to conform to some privacy concerns, not all. And he says the law is held. One of the things to remember about many of these so-called privacy laws, whether it be stellar win or whatever, they've held on the conservative Supreme Court. And this is the legacy of a court that is out of step with the society. It's sort of like the DNA story that we presented. And eventually that catches up with the court. That the court indeed is out of step with the times in which we live. And we see that moving along, nothing new there. So that's Karl Rove's report about the only thing he could say, but what difference does it make? Not a lot of difference at all. He's writing, first of all, in the Wall Street Journal. James Comey is selling books. He'll sell literally 1 million books out there, and that people want to know. I read his book. We'll review his book, and maybe we'll throw Uncle Carl in to it. Let me just move on here. Let's see if we can. We'll do Megyn Kelly there, as they call her. This is from Kate Fieldman. And where is she writing here? Oh, the New York Daily News. They said NBC took a $69 million chance on Megyn Kelly, and it looks like a failure. Well, she has not got the number, a 3-year contract, incidentally, to NBC premiering at 9 o'clock hour in September, and was almost immediately in controversy, a feud with Jane Fonda. Well, anyway, the viewership there on Sunday night, the news magazine show, was even a bigger disappointment. Kelly has lost 18% of the viewership over the last year's numbers, averaging just 2.4 million per episode, according to Nielsen. She's lost 28% of viewers between 25 and 54. The more important segment she has for patience, about all she can do. Let me, oops. The scandal in Texas. Now this is from Newsweek.com. Texas prisoners aren't allowed to read Where's Waldo, but they can read David Duke and Mein Kampf, some of the approved books. Alice Walker's book, The Color of Purple, is banned. It's about living in the South. It's blocked because it contains incense. Also blocked is Freakonomics. That's comprising collection of articles divulging into topics such as cheating and the economics of drug dealing is banned also. Inmates can't read Where's Waldo, Santa's Specular, because it contains stickers. Don't know. Anyway, Homer Simpson's Little Book of Laziness and Marty Parfound's Big Red Book are also restricted. Amongst it, 248,281 approved books. Inmates can read David Duke, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, on the National Socialism, World Relations here, James Bitterby's The Holy Book of Adolf Hitler is called by many the Bible of neo-Nazis. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice bans books for several reasons, such as detailed descriptions of illicit sex acts or information on criminal plans, according to the Dallas Morning News report. Books will cover that can be used to hide book covers. Contraband also blocked. Even the pop-up Harry Potter. Civil rights activists say inmates should be able to read whatever they want, and whether it's Hitler or Walker. Now, this is where we disagree. There is a proliferation of, in that Walker does not advocate violence, but these neo-Nazi types do. And this has also been a hole there. There are lots of prisoners, rights prisoners give up, but they shouldn't have to give up the one. That's Terry Baker, she's executive director of the Texas division of the American Civil Liberties Union. Adolf Hitler and David Duke should be there just as well. Simon Rusky, and Alice Walker. These are right-wing types there. And this is where the First Amendment problems, the ACLU has always had problems there. And we did go to the Dallas Morning News. I'm not sure we have that up here now, but we did go to it and its article on it and Texas prisoners. I think we'll put this up. We won't rehash what they have here, but what gets banned: information on the manufacture of explosive weapons and drugs, materials that a reasonable person would consider as written solely for the purpose of communicating information designed to achieve the breakdown of prison life. Naked or partially covered, this is crazy. Information on criminal schemes. Why pop-up books such as Harry Potter's Wizardry and the Amazing Spider-Man were banned. Other children's books, Hello Kitty and Homer Simpson, were put on the disapproval list because they're on unspeakable covers. Many graphic novels there, The Game of Thorns, comic books, titles The Walking Dead, Monty Python, The Big Book of Angels, the book of Shakespeare's sonnets were banned to contain nude image of children. This means the calendar of the Dallas cheerleaders is okay, but the Penthouse hottest girls of 1969, not so much. Sexually explicit images are defined as photos or drawings showing the sex act from any vantage point, frontal nudity, etc. Mailroom staff at each prison are the first to review the publications. Several other states, jails, and prisons also prohibit books with similar content. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has a far broader definition of what's approved, banning anything found to be or determined to be security, discipline, or in the good order of the institution. Rules in Texas and elsewhere means which books gets banned are often arbitrary, no doubt about that. That is from Nicole Porter. She's Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. And we already talked about the what happened with the color of purple. Several authors on the list: Stephen King, James Patterson. Some titles banned in other states, like the Game of Thorns and Slavery by Another Name. Freakonomics, some of the things there. And in the exclamation, Clark said Hitler's Nazi feces conforms to the state guidelines. Mein Kampf is on the approved list because it does not violate our rules. Well, that explains it all right there. My Awakening, in which David Duke argues for racial segregation of his Jewish supremacyism. And what about Mein Kampf? And this just tells you there that the state of Texas prison system is perpetuating white supremacy. Literally a training ground for white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Nazis, etc. And some of those people re-enter the community, or they have relatives in the community. So that's the problem right there. Let's go to the state of Arizona. Governor Ducey announced his plan here, and we'll see if we can get this up here, and you can listen to it before we do the sports. Maybe. This is from News 12 in Phoenix, Arizona. And we are still working towards that. And see how we come out here with Governor Ducey. We may or may not be able to get his video up here, but basically the teachers have not bought into his idea here of what he is actually talking about. We had him up prior to this, so for whatever reason, now we are having some difficulty in getting him there. We'll see if we can. Yeah, it appears we are not getting this up. We won't worry about it. He announced a raise. We'll just do it for him with agreement with Steve Yarborough and J.D. Messerod. Announced a deal on a 20% pay raise, and he came there to discuss it. Now, that's 20% by 2020, which is 2 years off, supporting staff, etc. They've talked about this before. There were over 100,000 people. So, in other words, the numbers marched on the state capitol the past 2 days now. And they're talking about returning also on a Monday. In other words, there will be some return there, and we're not getting that anyway. Now, this is the original story we had looked at here. Various states. We talked about the over 50,000 that showed up there. We played the video there, and also teachers from other states in solidarity with the teachers in Arizona have come from Colorado. We talked about that earlier there, and let me just go back here as we're winding the story down, at least for now. Well, the second day of the red shirts. We've all been wearing red shirts there at the state capitol in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, how he pulls this off, we don't know. The red for Ed said they set to rally again at the capitol on a Monday. So they will be there. And there's a live blog here on the Arizona. How will the walkout affect kids who depend on school meals? And that's a pathetic situation. 580,000 Arizona students meet the financial requirements for free meals. This is pathetic. One of the parents there, Mr. Chavez, Alejandro Chavez, said the teachers from the Phoenix Union High School District reached out to him and said the teachers whom he did not name identified students who need help in receiving lunches. So they're passing out potato chips, burritos with potatoes and eggs, sandwiches, and chips. And this mimics what happened in other places in Oklahoma and places of that nature, period. So that is the latest from Phoenix. Let's do the sports now. The Thunder and Jazz. The Jazz has ended that series. That score was 91-96. The Jazz, the Thunder is out of it. The Raptors and Wizards. It was the Raptors there. The Raptors win the series. Wait a minute here. Yeah. 4-2 over the Washington Wizards. The Cavaliers and Pacers. The Pacers is tied 3-3. Pacers 121-87 for Cleveland. Almost unbelievable score there. And we'll do hockey here while we're here. The Jets 4-1 over the Predators. They lead the series 1-0. That is in the NHL. Just make sure we got everybody here. Raptors, Wizards, Pacers, and Thunder, Jazz. Well, Thunder on out. In the NHL, we, of course, had the Predators there. And, let's see. The Jets and the Predators, the Jets of Winnipeg and the Nashville Predators. The Jets of Winnipeg, 4-1. They've been around a long time. Now, finally, to the Major League Baseball. The Cubbies pull one out in Wrigley Field over the Brewers of Milwaukee, 3-2. Line score there, the Cubs had 7 hits and 1 error, and the Brewers 4 hits and 1 error. This will be a more spirited contest as we go into start the summer season. Nonetheless, the Orioles finally win a game. They shut out the Tigers in Camden Yards 6-0. The Diamondbacks and Nationals in Washington. It was Diamondbacks 5-4. And in 11, the Cardinals and Pirates in Pittsburgh 6-5. Pirates over the Cardinals. In Atlanta and the Phillies in Philadelphia. Phillies 7-3 over Atlanta. The Rangers and Blue Jays in Toronto. Rangers 6-4. The Rays and Red Sox in Fenway Park. Rays 4-3 there. The Mariners and Cleveland in Cleveland. Cleveland 6-5. The Rockies and Marlins in Florida. Rockies 1 shut out the Marlins by a score of 1. The Rockies had 7 hits to no errors, and the Marlins 6 hits to no errors. Clean game. Cleanly played game, I guess. And the Reds in the Twin Cities. Cincy 15-9. The Reds had 20 hits in 1 error, and the Twins 14 hits. High hitting game. 14 hits and 1 error. The Athletics and Astros in Houston. It was all Athletics. 8-1 was the score there. In 11, the White Sox in Kansas City. In Kansas City, Sox win that 7-4. And a lot of extra inning games this early in the season. The Yankees and Angels out in California. Yankees pulled that out 4-3 there. Mr. Chapman got the save. The Mets and Padres in San Diego. It was the Mets 5-1. And finally, a game we tuned into, a high-spirited game. The LA Dodgers in San Francisco. Giants 6-4 line score there. The Giants had 4 hits and no errors, and the LA Dodgers 8 hits and no errors there. Mr. Dyson was a winner. And Mr. Strickland got the save. And it looks like, what is it? Klingon here was a loser. I don't know who in the hell he was. But anyway, that kind of leaves it there. This will do it for us. The week that was on the 28th of April, 2018. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on the Monday morning quarterback on the same channels that we brought you this one.